have another sort of newsletter. Finally clean up my newsletter file. So for 12 years, I was doing 2 different roundtable newsletters.
It was so well done and the sound was excellent.
Yes.
But
That's the original. Well, that's
oh my God, it was great. Steve did the same thing because he was in LA, so he really lived it.
yeah.
72. Oh yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, he was 72 was when he graduated. So that was right around that time. There was a place, Bill, and friends, sister, said, hey, you want to come to the summer party? Yes, I am. And I'm like, oh, okay, because it's like, cool, you know, older girls, and I didn't know what, you know, they made it out of Jefferson. This is started. So somebody cut it. So, I watched this journey into rock music. But okay, so I went ahead and yeah, exactly. That's okay, you know. I always tell people we got more time. So the clicker. So
Ready.
you ready for that? This is on,
Okay.
and if that dies, you gotta back
Got the
up.
back up.
You already know live, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hold down. That's your little round top. So,
All right, well, you guys have fun. It's,
10 minutes, yeah. Yeah, we'll see if a few more hardy souls.
I'll get you some water, I'll be right back.
Okay.
And I didn't ask you my question.
Yes.
Okay.
there is a difference of books to read. But they're not the standard books that you read about that. Yeah, yes, Europeans used it a lot. This book is great. Why? Because And while they were good, the women hated the Union soldiers more than the Confederate soldiers. And one of the key reasons was a Southern gentleman would never evade a woman's vengeance. Union soldiers did, and ransacking houses. And their animosity towards the particular British government was more than because women of the South never reconciled with the North. By the 1890s, the Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers were reconciling with each other. Not reenactments, but the last one, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg was huge. Well, the book is 25 square miles. This is. This is from the top of a little round top. And this is the Bureau. This is the North Gate. Bureau. This is the view of Governor Warren. one piece that I go by do around that. I did. Well, little round town, under yeah, that's good. He writes that, yeah, he finds, Ames coming up with, he'll get the position shortly before, out here, good for it. Good, good. So now that he's working, social relationship. He's going to be talking about but he's going to now tell you what you don't know. There are actually 109 years. 69 New York State religion is talking about Irish conquerors and they will fight on one down. And then there's that's what they pass for more troops after that. And 69 commanders, a lot of about 3 hours a year. There's a rule and they were navigating the world. Well, very well, no one. Because the 69 is so a lot of the world and young men in New York City. You know, having samples for answers so they don't want to be there's a management of the line that some officers
Hey, why don't we get started? I have one copy left if anyone wants a reading list. Oh, okay. Before we get started, I'll make a plug again for our meeting next Thursday, the Brooklyn Parish Civil War Roundtable meeting at the Civic Club. Meetings are open to the public. Socialization begins about 6:30. Starting at 7 o'clock. And right. And the topic will be the origin of the 69th Irish Regiment. And Harry tells the story of the old 69, which still exists today. one of the few units in the Army that still retains its regimental marking. They fight in World War I, they fight in World War II. I believe they also fight in the Korean War at the 59th New York Militia, which is different than the 69th Volunteer New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which is the first regiment in the Irish Brigade, which fights primarily they go into action at Antietam as the first major action, and they'll suffer heavily at Fredericksburg, and they will be at Gettysburg. If anyone here been to Gettysburg, you've seen the Father Corbin, Fair Catch Corby. He's got his hand up like this. That's what he's known as. This is the chaplain for the Irish Brigade. He blesses the Irish Brigade before they go into action. And the statue of him he's standing up blessing the troops. But the Rangers call him Fair Catch Corbin, waiting for that football to come down. Don't need to use the pointer much on this one, so hopefully we won't have any pointer accidents. Today we're going to be talking about the Orphans of Gettysburg. Who was their father? The story of how an unidentified soldier was identified, and how he was identified, and what happens to the orphans that he leaves behind. Turn it on again. There we go. Let's see if it works. Unbelievable. Hey, Lynn, if you're listening, the pointer isn't working, or the advance isn't working. Here she comes. Yeah, okay. Okay. Was that you? Or was okay. Very good. Thank you. We solved it, Lynn. This story begins in Cattaraugus County in the western southern tier of New York State, where 1,065 men of the 154th New York Volunteer Infantry were recruited in late 1862. The regiment, also known as the Hardtack Regiment, was mustered in for federal service in September of 1862 for 3 years. It was assigned to the 11th Corps, the smallest corps in the Union Army of the Potomac at that time, with a little over 12,000 effectives. The Corps commander we spoke about when we spoke about Jackson was General Oliver Otis Howard. The 11th Corps contained 27 regiments, almost half of them, 13 of them, that were German regiments. By German regiments, they were German volunteers, primarily from Pennsylvania, where they spoke German and very little English, and were led by officers who could speak German. So this was a mixed regiment at the time, and that presents some problems. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, which we spoke about when we talked about Jackson's flank attack, in May of 1863, the 11th Corps comprised the right flank of the Army in the wilderness. And as we mentioned, the flank was in the air, that is not properly anchored on a defensible landmark. When Jackson's Second Corps with 27,000 men struck the 11th Corps by surprise at dinner time, the 11th Corps was basically rolled up like as one of the officers said, we were rolled up like a wet blanket. Losses consisted of 217 killed, over 1,200 wounded, and about 1,000 captured or missing, for a total of about 2,400 casualties. Because so many of the 11th Corps fled the Confederate onslaught, the 11th Corps became known in the Army of the Potomac as the Flying Dutchman. And this was the map of the flank attack. At Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, and I got my Gettysburg map tie on, the Corps was the second Corps to arrive on the field about midday. The first Corps, which we spoke about when we talked about Abner Doubleday, was heavily engaged in fighting to the west of town. The 1st and 3rd Divisions of the 11th Corps were sent north to link up with 1st Corps. That was about in the early afternoon. So this is 11th Corps here. They've linked up with 1st Corps, or linking up with 1st Corps. They do leave a gap here, which is part of the problem. But the fighting north of Gettysburg by 11th Corps, they redeemed their good name that day with holding against fairly significant Confederate forces. However, about 2 p.m., Richard Ewell's Confederate 2nd Corps, arriving from the north, links up and will outflank the 11th Corps line, causing it to collapse. Gettysburg is an interesting battle in that the Northern Army arrives from the south and the Southern Army arrives from the north. Most of Lee's army has already passed Gettysburg, and so they attack from the north while the Union Army is moving up from a defensive line between Baltimore and Gettysburg. The 2nd Division of the 11th Corps had been left at Cemetery Hill to set up a defensive position. So only 2 divisions of the 11th Corps were fighting north of Gettysburg. Colonel Charles Coster was ordered to take his 1st Brigade in the 2nd Division out to the edge of town, where it would sacrifice itself, buying time to allow the retreating soldiers of the 1st and 3rd Divisions to retreat back to Cemetery Hill in their defensive position there. This fight would later become known as the Brickyard Fight, or Coster's Last Stand. The brigade filed through a narrow carriage gateway into Coon's Brickyard, which consisted of brick kilns, a house, and a fenced-off area. There was only one way into the brickyard and no other way out. The brigade took a position along a fence line, the 27th Pennsylvania on the left, the 154th New York in the center, and the 134th on the right. They had no idea that they were outnumbered 3-1 and outflanked on both ends by Hayes's brigade on the left and Avery's North Carolina brigade on the right. Remember, we spoke about the size of brigades. Coster's brigade is probably about 600 men at this point, 700 men, while these are 2 Confederate brigades that are about 1,500 to 2,000 men. The way the 2 armies reinforced the brigades, or didn't reinforce brigades. The casualty rate for the 154th that afternoon was 78%. Of the 224 men taken into the brickyard, only 15 stood for roll call on Cemetery Hill that evening. Some additional men stumbled into the position during the night. Howard's 11th Corps losses for the 3-day Battle of Gettysburg
were just over 3,800 casualties of the less than 9,000 men engaged, for an overall casualty rate of 42%. Now, after the Pickett-Pettigrew assault on the afternoon of the 3rd had failed, General Lee put his battered army in a defensive position, expecting a counterattack by Union forces on July 4th. But none came, and so on the evening of the 4th, the Army of Northern Virginia will slip away from Gettysburg westward over the mountains. The Army of the Potomac will wake up on July 5th, the morning of July 5th, to discover the Confederate lines to be empty, and they began their follow-up of the retreating Confederate Army. Quote, Gettysburg in the aftermath of the great battle was an appalling place. Wrecked caissons and wagons littered 25 square miles of battlefield. Shells, cannonballs, and musket balls were everywhere, embedded in trees, fences, and houses, and dotting the surface of the ground. And everywhere were the bodies of men, transforming Gettysburg into a vast city of the dead. A soldier's body had been discovered a few days after the battle in an overgrown empty lot on the corner of York and Stratton Streets. The soldier was in a sitting position, having been hit above the heart. There was no identification, no regimental number on his cap, no corps badge on his jacket, no letters, no diary, nothing but a blood-stained ambrotype of 3 small children clutched in his hands. From the location of the wound, he would have had only moments to reach for the picture. The sweet, tragic appearance of this soldier so affected the town folks who discovered him that the image was not buried with him. He was buried as an unknown, but in a marked grave. The ambrotype was given to the wife of the man who discovered it, Peter Beitler. His wife, Emma, in turn, passed it on to her father, Benjamin Shriver, who was a tavern owner of a small tavern in the town of Grafenberg, about 13 miles west of Gettysburg. Now, I give you all these details because you will see that there are events that occur that almost make this somewhat predetermined. Dr. J. Francis Bournes was a wealthy Philadelphia physician who volunteered his services as a contract surgeon to tend some of the wounded at Gettysburg who still remained in the huge military tent hospital known as Camp Letterman for months after the battle. Bournes traveled from Philadelphia to Chambersburg, a designated rendezvous point for civilian physicians heading to the battlefield. Bournes and 3 other physicians were forced to stop at Shriver's Tavern because their wagon broke down. They stayed there the night, heard the story of the fallen soldier from the tavern owner, Benjamin Shriver, and saw the photograph of the children. Dr. Bournes convinced Shriver to give him the ambrotype so they might attempt to locate the dead man's family. As a lifelong bachelor, Bournes may have yearned for a wife and children of his own and was touched by this sad story. Bournes was at Camp Letterman for a number of weeks and then returned to Philadelphia and had the ambrotype copied, producing hundreds of inexpensive carte de vis. That's a carte de vis. The pictures on one side, the back of it had the printing on it. Newspapers of the time could not print a photograph. Bournes knew he might need many carte de vis to put the image of the 3 children before the public in hopes that someone might know them. Bournes also had a series of articles written in local newspapers, and these in turn were picked up by newspapers throughout the Northeast. The most prominent appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on October 19, 1863, under the heading, "Whose Father Was He?" This is the social media process of the 19th century. This is from the paper. After the Battle of Gettysburg, a Union soldier was found in a secluded spot on the field where, wounded, he had lain himself down to die. In his hands, tightly clasped, was an ambrotype containing the portraits of 3 small children, and upon this picture his eyes, set in death, rested. The last object upon which the dying father looked was the image of his children, and as he silently gazed upon them, his soul slipped away. How touching, how solemn. What pen can describe the emotions this patriot father, as he gazed upon these children so soon to be made orphans? Wounded and alone, the din of battle still sounding in his ears, he lies down to die. His last thought and prayers are for his family. He has finished his work on earth. His last battle has been fought. He has freely given his life to his country, and now, while his life's blood is ebbing, he clasps in his hands the image of his children, and commending them to the God of the fatherless, rests his last lingering look upon them. When, after the battle, the dead were being buried, this soldier was thus found. The ambrotype was taken from his embrace, and since been sent to this city for recognition. Nothing else was found upon this person by which he might be identified. His grave has been marked, however, so that if by any means this ambrotype will lead to his recognition, he can be disinterred. This picture is now in the possession of Dr. Bournes, number 1104 Spring Garden of this city, who can be called upon or addressed in reference to it. The children, 2 boys and a girl, are apparently 9, 7, and 5 years of age, the boys being respectively the oldest and youngest of the 3. The youngest boy sitting in a high chair, and on each side of him are his brother and sister. The eldest boy's jacket is made from the same material as his sister's dress. These are the most prominent features of the group. It is earnestly desired that all the papers in the country will draw attention to the discovery of this picture and its attendant circumstances, so that, if possible, the family of the dead hero may come into possession of it. Of what inestimable value will it be to these children, proving as it does that the last thoughts of their dying father was for them and them only." Unquote. One such publication carrying the story was the widely circulated American Presbyterian. Fortunately, the only subscriber in the small town of Portville, near Olean, New York, saw and showed the account to a Mrs. Humiston, the wife of a soldier. She had sent her husband just such a picture as described. He had last written to her a few days after the Battle of Chancellorsville. He had received the picture, but that was the last communication she had received from him. She asked the town postmaster to write to Dr. Bournes on her behalf and request a copy of the ambrotype. When she opened the express letter from Philadelphia in late November 1863, Philinda Humiston knew her husband, Amos Humiston, and the father of her 3 children, Franklin, Alice, and Frederick, was dead. The story of the now identified soldier was carried in the Philadelphia Times. It was reported that Dr. Bournes planned to visit Portville and return the ambrotype to the widow. It was also reported that it was hoped a sufficient sum of money could be raised by the sale of the photograph to give each of the children a good education. If enough money was raised by interest generated by this touching story, a soldier's orphan home might be successfully funded. About 700 photos had been sold at 25 cents a copy, but this was not collected quickly enough to ease the desperate need of the Humiston family. On January 2nd, 1864, Dr. Bournes visited the family and received the gratitude of the whole town. Shortly thereafter, a second carte de vie appeared with the image of Amos, identified as Sergeant Amos Humiston of the 154th New York Volunteers. Printed on the back was the text written by Dr. Bournes, quote, "Sergeant Humiston fell in the first day's struggle at Gettysburg. When found, he could not be recognized and was buried among the unknown dead. But the picture his brave hand grasped in death, the portrait of his 3 little children, months afterwards led to his identification. After the discovery of his family, who reside at Portville, New York, the original of this photograph was obtained, and the copies are sold in aid of the Orphans Homestead. J. Francis Bourne, Secretary, Philadelphia, PA. After the war, efforts began in earnest to choose a location for an orphanage. An executive board of 28 members was formed and funds were sought. Donations of $25 made an individual a shareholder with privileges of electing a soldier's orphan or some other child to admittance to the home. The orphans were to be given proper care and education until they were old enough to support themselves. A $50 donation allowed one to be a lifetime member of the association, and a $100 donation made one an honorary life director. Although it was called a national homestead, the institution was primarily supported by donations from Sabbath schools or religious schools or private individuals, all in northern states. By April of 1866, the Sabbath schools donating to the cause showed an overwhelming majority vote to establish the home in Gettysburg as the Orphans Homestead, a property on Baltimore Street which coincidentally had served as headquarters for O.O. Howard and the 11th Corps at the time of the battle, was purchased. It consisted of 2 acres, a large 2-story brick house, stables, good water, a garden, and a fine orchard. After the establishment of the homestead, Mrs. Humiston and her 3 children came to Gettysburg to live at the orphanage. Felinda was the first matron of the facility. By October 30th, 1866, 22 orphans were settled in the homestead. Local women made their first Christmas a real feast with donations of presents and special foods. In October of 1868, a wealthy banker bequeathed $200,000 to orphans' homes in the loyal states. Petitions were presented to Congress to obtain bonds for construction of additional buildings, but these failed. So it was that churches and private citizens were primarily responsible for the loving care provided to over 200 children throughout the 10 years' existence of the homestead. The homestead was visited and supported by various Civil War generals in the first several years, including George Meade, O.O. Howard, and Ulysses S. Grant. The children, now numbering 35 girls and 25 boys, participated in a number of patriotic celebrations, including George Washington's birthday in February, July 4th, a Decoration Day, which will become known as Memorial Day in May. And on this latter day, children would carry bouquets of flowers and banners to the National Cemetery to decorate the graves of Union soldiers that lay there, including that of Amos Humiston. By 1869, the enrollment had risen to 70 and then 100 by 1870. A new 3-story frame structure was built to house the girls. The schoolhouse was in the rear of the new building, and the staff had grown with a principal, a vice principal, a steward, and a supervisor of sewing with several assistants. Felinda Humiston had caught the eye of a lieutenant who was passing through Gettysburg, and she subsequently married Lieutenant Asa Barnes of Becket, Massachusetts, on October 26, 1869, in a ceremony at the homestead. Alice and Fred joined their mother, in their new home in Becket, Massachusetts. But Frank, the oldest, was to remain at the homestead in order to prepare for college. As enrollment grew, so did expenses. So to generate some income and keep contributors abreast of the operation, a homestead journal with stories of the children was published and sold starting in 1869. Many of the stories tell of quiet, withdrawn, often undernourished, sad orphans who began to blossom at the homestead with its loving, supportive staff and teachers. Few boarding schools could excel the homestead in excellence in education. The sanitary conditions were so good that from its start in 1866 to 1869, there was not one case of a protracted illness or a death. Deaths in orphanages averaged probably about 10 to 20%. Over 700 Sabbath schools in 18 states were now shareholders in the homestead. A new superintendent, Mr. C. E. Hilton, and his wife, who were responsible for the academic excellence, served without accepting a monetary reward. Dr. Bournes, as Secretary General of the Homestead, submitted a report on May 22, 1872, in which he described the conditions of the homestead, including its continued excellence. In the report, he introduced a new matron, Mrs. Rosa Carmichael. Quote, "The school is thoroughly organized and under the control and instruction of Mrs. Rosa Carmichael, assisted by several of the eldest children, whose education is so advanced as to fit them well for the duty. As a teacher and disciplinarian, Mrs. Carmichael has few equals, and she is a most assiduous and faithful worker, laboring often beyond her strength in school and out." Unquote. However, the absence of the homestead children from Memorial Day procession in 1876 was the first public confirmation that the children were experiencing a marked change in their lives. An indignant local humanitarian, Mr. E. Woodward, wrote a poem that was published goading the local GAR chapter in Gettysburg, which supported the homestead, goading them into some type of action. Quote, this is the poem he submitted. "Where are the children of the slain? Are they enjoying freedom or in pain? No, they are kept like gallery slaves, while strangers decorate their fathers' graves. At Gettysburg, at the orphan's home, a modern bourgeois doth rage and foam on the consecrate Memorial Day, where a nation its grateful tributes pay." It had been rumored and later confirmed that the children were confined in a dark hole in the basement called a dungeon. They were put in shackles and were suspended by the arms and barrels. One of the older boys, age 19, was a taskmaster and kicked and beat smaller children. A 5-year-old boy had been penned in the outhouse on a cold Christmas Eve until his pathetic screams were heard by a neighbor. Investigations were made by the directors, but inspections really showed nothing because the abused children were apparently hidden from the inspectors. Mrs. Carmichael had discouraged visits by local women and made it clear to the townfolk that they had no right to intervene in her management of the homestead. Rumors reached the church group benefactors and donations began to drop off. Enrollment was halted and education of the orphans stopped because the teachers left. GAR Post Number 9 in Gettysburg conferred with the state organization, and a member took one of the boy orphans into his home in Gettysburg. That child would later testify against Mrs. Carmichael in court. Legal actions were not long in coming. Mrs. Carmichael was arrested and charged with cruelty to one of the orphans, then released on a $300 bond and returned to the homestead pending her trial. After her trial in August of 1876, Rosa Carmichael was found guilty. She was fined $20 and was ordered out of town. However, she made a continued efforts to deny the accusations and hired a local lawyer in an attempt to maintain jurisdiction over the homestead. The townfolk and the local GAR wanted to protect the children from Bournes and Carmichael, and a war of words began in local newspapers that raged on for several months until 1877 before Carmichael finally left the orphanage. What role Dr. Bournes played in this is unclear. It was a fact that he knew of the abuse of the children by Mrs. Carmichael and was therefore at least an accessory to the maltreatment. He He had spent his summers in Gettysburg at the homestead, being waited upon by the children. His relationship with Rosa was likewise unclear. Had she been his housekeeper in Philadelphia? Was she his mistress? There was evidence that he embezzled monies from the homestead account and even from the original sales of the photographs to the public. Funds were initially used to purchase a home for Farina and her family in Portville. When the family, however, moved to the homestead, Alice, as an adult, stated the family never received any funds from the sale of that house. It is not known when Bournes had really started to do this. Some suspect that he saw the whole thing as a money-making scheme from the very beginning. The homestead had been debt-free until it was mortgaged for $7,000 by Dr. Bournes in 1877. Additionally, Gettysburg had employment taxes in 1874 and 1875, and if you worked in Gettysburg, you had to pay a small tax to the town, and Bournes paid that tax, indicating that he was on the payroll of the homestead also at that time. When these facts came out, the founding principle of the homestead was seriously violated. A number of children in the homestead steadily dropped off and was reduced by adoption or transfer to other orphanages or returned to their original families. On Friday, December 21st, 1877, a small notice appeared in the Gettysburg newspaper. Quote, "To be closed. The Soldiers' Orphans' Home in this place is about winding up. There are now only 9 inmates, and these leave this week." Unquote. Mark Dunkelman is an author and a historian who lives in Providence, Rhode Island. As a child, he had heard stories about his great-great-grandfather, John Langhams, who had served during the Civil War. There were 6 preserved letters that Langhams had sent home during the war, along with ribbons worn at regimental reunions. Mark decided he wanted to publish a regimental history of the 154th New York Volunteer Infantry. In 30 years of research and collection, he connected with over 1,000 descendants of members of the 154th and had compiled over 1,600 wartime letters, 25 diaries, and over 200 photographs of members, making it one of the largest collections of primary source material on any single Civil War regiment. He published it as under the title The Hardtack Regiment, along with Mike Winey, who was with a brief version of the Humiston story included in the book The Hardtack Regiment. Humiston, as it turned out, was the most well-known of the 1,065 men who served in the regiment. Dunkelman later felt he wanted to learn more about Humiston, the man, and not Humiston, the corpse. But he didn't really know where to begin to do research on Humiston. He started by going to Portville, New York. There's an idyllic setting. He went to the Humiston's hometown and spoke to residents, and some of the residents gave him a clue about a Humiston descendant. Mark was able to locate a great-grandson by the name of David Humiston Kelly. Who was professor emeritus at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. Kelly was an archaeologist who had been able to crack the code of the Mayan hieroglyphics, which allowed archaeologists to decipher the Mayan writings. So he's the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphics. Kelly also had some Humiston material that he shared with Dunkelman, but he had very little information on Amos. He had information of what had happened to Farina and the 3 children after the war. They did not like being celebrities, particularly celebrities born out of tragedy, and they tried to escape the limelight and disappear into obscurity. Oops. Try it again. There we go. Professor Kelly grew up in Jaffney, New Hampshire, where his grandfather, Frank Humiston, was. Kelly explained that he also saw his great uncle Fred Humiston occasionally, but he rarely saw his great aunt Alice. He also knew about the story of Humiston and his wife. She was born Philinda Betsy Insworth. She had first married Justin Smith in Western New York at a young age. Justin, however, died of some disease shortly after being married. She later married Amos after he had died at Gettysburg. She married the older Reverend Asa Barnes, who was also a lieutenant in the Union Army. So in genealogic terms, Philinda was Philinda Betsy Ensworth Smith Humiston Barnes, if you want to keep track of all those families. This is a family tree. There's Amos and Philinda, the three children, Franklin, who becomes a doctor, Frederick, Alice. Franklin marries Carrie Tarbell and has a daughter who marries David Kelly's father. And this is Professor Kelly down here. The professor also had in his possession an ambrotype of Amos Humiston himself, taken before the war. In the picture, Amos is beardless, but a second picture of Amos that was circulated after his body had been identified, that was circulated by Dr. Bournes. Bournes apparently borrowed the pre-war picture of Philinda, and in the photographic studio where it was replicated, the picture was photoshopped. There you go, another 19th century term, to make it more typical of a soldier. A beard was added, and the neck region was made to look like a uniform. So we have social media and photoshopping of the 19th century, showing that we aren't making history here. We're just building on old history. Sometime later, Mark Dunkelman and his wife were invited to a dinner party hosted by their friends, an Episcopalian minister and his wife. The party was to introduce another minister, Gardner Shattuck, who had written a book entitled A Shield and a Hiding Place. The book itself was about religion in both the Union and Confederate armies during the war. Dunkelman and Shattuck talked the whole evening, and eventually the Humiston story came up. By chance, the minister said, Eleanor Cox, Amos's granddaughter, was the church secretary in a parish in Belmont, Massachusetts, where Shattuck had worked for a while. So with that information, the next day, Dunkelman got the phone number of a Mrs. John Cox in Belmont, and he made a phone call. A male voice answered when he called, and Dunkelman explained why he was calling. Alan Lawrence Cox replied that, "You are lucky you caught me. My mother's in a nursing home, and I stop by the house once a month to check on things, and you happened to catch me while I was here. I have Amos's wartime letters at home. Why don't you come up sometime and take a look at them?" A day or two later, Mark Dunkelman drove to Belmont and met Alan Cox, a retired salesman who was Amos Humiston's great-grandson. Alan explained that his mother was in the nursing home and her name was Eleanor Humiston Cox. Her father had been Fred Humiston, who also had been a salesman. We're talking about Alan down here, his mother, Eleanor Ensworth Humiston, one of two daughters of Frederick Humiston. He was the young child in the high chair. Alan had a shoebox full of letters from Amos. Alan Cox let Dunkelman copy all the letters in the box. Alan then planned to donate the letters to the Historical Society in Portville. Philinda had saved the letters, passed them down to Fred, who passed them down to his daughter Eleanor, who gave them to Alan, who then misplaced them in his house full of boxes. He was a hoarder. The letters have disappeared. Fortunately, Dunkelman had made copies of all of them before they were lost by Alan. I suspect Alan probably realized their value and sold them to a collector, but that's my interpretation of that. Uh, the letters that Dunkelman copied show Amos to be a loving man and a lonely man, but he could express himself in his letters. September 5th, 1862. Dear wife, tell the babies that I want to see them very much. November 22nd, 1862. If there is a place on God's earth that I hate, that place is Virginia. January 2nd, 1863. If ever I live to get home, you will not complain of being lonesome again or sleeping cold, for I will lay as close to you as the bark to a tree. March 9th, 1863. Oh, sorry, January 29th, 1863. How I should like to call in this morning and see how you are getting along, and then I should not like to leave you again. Remember me to the children and be a good girl. The thing of being a good girl is in many soldiers' letters, interestingly. March 9th, 1863. It has been very lonely here without you, but there is no use in talking about it. Let us hope for the best. May 24th, 1863. I want you to write to me as often as you can and not wait for me, and be a good girl and keep your courage up. So goodbye, yours truly, A. Humiston. There was even a poem that he wrote. I am very sad tonight, dear wife. My thoughts are dwelling on home and thee, as I keep the lone night watch beneath the holly tree. The winds are sighing through the trees, and as they onward roam, they whisper hopes of happiness within our cottage home. The critical letter that Dunkelman sought was also there. It was the second to last letter that he wrote after the Battle of Chancellorsville and several weeks before Gettysburg. This is the letter. May 9, 1863, camp near Stafford. That's Stafford, Virginia. Dear wife, it is with pleasure that I address a few lines to you to let you know that I am in the land of the living after the battle. The last letter that I wrote to you, I was in the hospital, but when Captain Warner came back, I was with company and was in the last battle at Chancellorsville and got away with a whole head, but I got a swipe in the side with a spent ball that made me think of home. It struck on the short ribs just over the heart, but glanced off. If it had not, I should not be writing to you. The 154th has gained a name, but at what a loss. Our company has lost 17 in killed, wounded, and missing. Seymour Sykes is killed. He was hit with a piece of shell in the head. Mart Champlain is missing, but that is all that is missing from our place. The regiment lost 227 men. We had a hard fight. I am tired and worn out with hard marching and hard fare. I looked for a letter from you, but when I got back, did not. I am in hopes to get one tonight. I got the likeness of the children, and it pleased me more than anything that you could have sent me. How I want to see them and their mother is more than I can tell. I hope that we may all live to see each other again if this war does not last too long. The first time that I see you, I will tell you more than I can think of now. Be a good girl, so goodbye, A.H. Mark Dunkelman now had a clearer mental image of Amos Humiston, the man, and this was the basis of his second book. Photocopies, yeah. So those are the photocopies. Yeah. Just getting to that. Amos Humiston was born April 26, 1830. So at the time of the Civil War, he's about 31, 32 years old. He was born in Owego, New York, in Tioga County. He was one of 4 children of Ambrose Humiston and Mary Bronson Humiston. His life was one of tragedy and hard work. His father died in 1837 when he was 7 years old. Tragedy struck the family again when Amos's sister Maria drowned in an accident while crossing a frozen pond. He attended local schools and followed his brother Morris into an apprenticeship as a harness maker. Amos completed his apprenticeship at age 20. However, in 1850, he signed up with Captain John Keene Hathaway aboard a whaling ship, the Harrison. Amos and a crew of about 30 sailors left from New Bedford, Massachusetts on December 12, 1850. He was at sea for 3.5 years, making the equivalent of about 17 cents a day. His mother died on November 26, 1851, at the age of 47 while he was at sea. When he returned, he became a harness maker and shortly thereafter married a young widow, Farina, and they had 3 children. He enlisted on July 26, 1862, after Lincoln had called for 300,000 more volunteers. He enlisted after he was assured that his family would be cared for while he was away and if he did not return. He was mustered in as a corporal in Company C of the 154th. He was ill for weeks as the 154th marched back and forth in Northern Virginia. He wrote in one letter, "I can die in battle like a man, but I hate the idea of dying here like a hog." His body was found a quarter of a mile from the brickyard. Later, he was reburied in the National Cemetery at Gettysburg in the New York State section in a marked grave. Today at Gettysburg, near the brickyard, there's a monument to Amos Humiston and his children. It's the only monument to an individual enlisted man on the Gettysburg battlefield. That's a close-up of the plaque. Oops. Let's go back. Farina remarried Asa Barnes in Gettysburg on December 26, 1869. I think she was probably about 20 years old when he married her. So she was probably born 10 years after he was. Asa Barnes was 25 years older than Farina, and they moved to Asa's home in Becket, Massachusetts. Asa died on February 12, 1881, and Farina eventually moved in with her son Franklin in East Jaffrey, New Hampshire. She died on November 18, 1913, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Another one of those just chance things. She was 82 years old when she died. Franklin Humiston left the homestead and continued his education at Lawrence Academy in Groton, Massachusetts. He then attended Dartmouth College and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine in 1886. That year, he married Carrie Tarbell and opened his medical practice in Jaffrey. In his 25 years of practice, he delivered over 1,000 babies. He never spoke to people in his town about being one of the children of the battlefield. He died before his mother died on December 30th, 1912, at the age of 57. It was a complication of appendicitis, actually. He was buried in Jaffrey. A playground in Jaffrey is still called Humiston Field. This is the gravestone in Jaffrey. Farina is on top. She's the mother of the 3 children, died in 1913. Franklin, he predeceases her in 1912. His wife, she dies in 1945. His brother Frederick is also buried there. He dies also in 1913, and his wife dies in 1952. Speaking of, this is the Humiston Field, the ball field. Alice Humiston also attended Lawrence Academy after her family moved to Massachusetts. She moved several times as an adult, living in numerous towns in New England finding employment as an office worker and as a caretaker. She never married. She worked in a real estate office, in a state home and school for dependent and neglected children, and in the New York State Health Department in Albany, New York, a block down from the hospital I practiced in for a number of years. Another one of those freaky connections. In the late 19, actually, I found even more connections than we'll go into that. In the late 1920s, she moved with her niece, Alice Mildred Humiston, Frank's daughter, to Los Angeles, and she worked in the catalog department of the library at UCLA in 1929. So here's the right button here. Here's Alice. She doesn't marry. Another one of Franklin's children, named after her aunt, Alice Mildred Humiston. These two go to Los Angeles. They live together. Neither actually marries. She sent a book on the Battle of Gettysburg to her young nephew, David Humiston Kelly. So she sends him a book about Gettysburg, which sparks his interest in history and archaeology. On December 16th, 1933, Alice was tidying her home when her skirt came too close to the flames of a heater. Within seconds, she was engulfed in flames. Neighbors came quickly to douse the flames, but Alice died in the hospital 2 days later. Professor Kelly inherited an empty envelope from Alice. Dr. Bournes had promised to return the original ambrotype to Philinda, but he never did. The envelope contained just one of the thousands of carte de vis that he produced. On the envelope, Alice had written a sad complaint against Dr. Bournes, quote, "My mother was young, or this would not have happened," unquote. And both are buried in the same cemetery, Alice and her niece. Frederick Humiston married Nettie Orne of West Somerville, Massachusetts, December 17th, 1896. And they lived the rest of their lives in Massachusetts. He was a chicken farmer initially and then a successful grain merchant. He died in 1918 at the age of 59. He sired the two children, Doris and Eleanor. The daughters visited Gettysburg in 1958 and donated to the National Park Museum a picture of their grandfather, Amos Humiston, and a song sheet, "The Children of the Battlefield," that was signed by their grandmother, Philinda. Doris never married and died several years later. Eleanor married John Cox, and they had their son, Alan Humiston Cox, who gave that box of letters sent by Humiston to his wife. So Frederick, two daughters, Doris, who dies, and Eleanor, who marries John Cox, and this is the hoarder who had the letters. Dr. Francis Bourne was born in Waynesville, Pennsylvania. He was related to the poet Robert Burns. He was born in 1814. He was a school teacher, but later went to medical school, graduated from Pennsylvania Medical School in 1850 and practiced in Norristown outside of Philadelphia and Philadelphia. He became a contract surgeon during the Civil War. After the homestead closed, he practiced until retirement. In 1897, he was struck by a bicyclist, and he dies in the physician's home in Norristown on December 21st, 1899, of complications of this injury. Rosa J. Carmichael remains elusive. Extensive research failed to produce any background other than what is known at the homestead. Neither her date of birth, nor her maiden name, nor her husband's name, nor her date of death are known. Census records show no such person in Philadelphia. According to the GAR records, Dr. Bournes brought her from Philadelphia, and after she left the homestead, she returned to Philadelphia. Carmichael was probably an alias name, and this may explain why she's never appeared in census records. So she disappears as mysteriously as she appeared. The homestead was closed after the last orphan left. There were many liens on the property, and in January 1878, there was a sheriff's sale at the homestead. The sale netted $850. In the spring of 1878, the building and 7 acres were sold. For the next 25 years, there were several owners and businesses ranging from a center for social events to a summer boarding house for teachers visiting Gettysburg. In 1903, the original brick homestead building was bought and converted into a beautiful family dwelling with extensive floral gardens. The schoolhouse in back was demolished, and the frame portion of the homestead was moved next door to a double lot and converted into a 2-family dwelling. In 1959, Cliff Arquette, stage name Charlie Weaver on the show Hee Haw, bought the brick building. Cliff was also an avid Civil War buff and wished to display his large collection of original uniforms. He opened the Cliff Arquette Soldiers Museum. Professional commitments, however, forced him to sell it in 1966. However, he lent his name to the new owners who opened the expanded Charlie Weaver's American Museum on the Civil War. In 1991, it was acquired by the Recreational Holding Company, and a new facade was built, disguising its original appearance. It became the Soldiers National Museum, which closed in late 2014, a year after the sesquicentennial of the Battle of Gettysburg. The former dormitory remained a residence for many years, and in 1915 became the first bed and breakfast in Gettysburg. Over the years, a number of the former orphans and their descendants have returned to visit the 2 structures, testifying to the good care they provided that they got there before Carmichael came. Years later, Mary Ruth Collins, a Gettysburg native who was a school nurse in the Gettysburg school system, inherited the building in 1987. She and the current owner of the homestead lodgings for tourists. So you can stay there if you visit Gettysburg. There were about 200 over the course of its 10 years existence. The highest population at any one time was a little over 100. They kept, well, yeah, I believe so. But like medical records, though, they may have been discarded after so many years. Yeah, the statute, medical records, if they're not computerized, I don't know what, I'm not certain what they were mandated to do back in the 1800s, or how long those records were kept. Today in Gettysburg, there's a long windowless storage building in the region of the Coon Brickyard. In 1977, Dunkelman received permission by the owner to paint a mural on the blank wall. The mural was conceived, researched, and designed and funded by Mark Dunkelman. The final mural was painted by a Rhode Island artist, Ann Dunkelman. The mural was dedicated on July 1st, 1988, on the 125th anniversary of the battle. The Coster Avenue mural depicts the fight between the Union brigades of Colonel Charles Coster and the Confederate brigades of Harry Hayes and Isaac Avery. It depicts the climatic moment when the Confederates rushed the brickyard fence defended by the 154th and 134th in New York and 27th, Pennsylvania. Booklets describing the wall are sold at the visitor center and funds the upkeep of the mural. So these are a series of pictures from one end to the other. And if you want to see the whole mural, I have a copy of it here on the table. This picture shows Charlie Fennell. Charlie is one of the park rangers and a historian. He's written a number of interesting books. I don't know this man here. This is Mark Dunkelman. And this is Wayne Motz, who is a historian and archivist. And here's Amos Humiston back here. Mark Dunkelman painted him with the color guard. There's a close-up. Excuse me. John Hennessy, historian at Fredericksburg National Military Park, spoke to a group of us on a tour of Second Manassas, and I alluded to a little bit of that last time. John said that the greatest fear a soldier felt and feared was the fall in battle where no one knew where he had died. He would lie in an unmarked grave, forgotten, and even his family would never know where and how he had died. John related several stories of soldiers, but finished with a letter that he had discovered written by James R. Woodworth, a soldier in the 44th New York Volunteer Infantry, to his wife. Woodworth was killed at Chancellorsville. Quote from his letter: "Should it be my lot to die during the present struggle, let the thought that I die in the defense of my country console you. And when peace, with its happy train of attendants, shall once more visit this land, let it be your greatest joy to teach my child that I was one who loved my country more than life. This is the only legacy I can bequeath to him, but it is one that a prince might well be proud of." Unquote. Amos Humiston should not fear being forgotten. He reaches out and touches us today from 160 years ago. Thank you. Questions? Hey, make a plea again. Our meeting is next Thursday, 7 o'clock, Civic Center, talking about the Irish Brigade. I have two other pictures up here. I have a picture of what Pickett's division saw when they came out of the woods at the site of the Virginia the monument at Gettysburg, looking across the field to the Union line. And on the flip side here, what not Joshua Chamberlain, but what Strong Vincent, who commanded the brigade, was at the top of Little Round Top, looking down towards Devil's Den when the attack was made at Little Round Top on July 2nd. And this is the last of the Civil War series that I'm giving. Silver Bullet. Yeah.
I was going to bring it to you if I can remember some Thursday.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be fascinated to look at that.
It's part fiction
Oh, okay.
and part
Yeah.
real.
Okay.
He did a lot of work. Not as technical and well written, but because I read it, and my wife read it. She worked for him.
Oh,
He was
okay.
Art free
Oh, neurosurgeon?
neurosurgeon.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Glad you did.
So if I can remember, I'll do that.
Okay.
I should remember it today. I mean, you would be interested in reading, maybe you aren't, but that's I want back and forth.
Yeah, right, right. Thank you.
better the taxes. So it's a double, year and a half, better to gauge. Yeah, that's all. But he's the one who's found, it doesn't die here, but he was the guy found in the quarter mile away, every block. So, the whole line collapsed here. Well, he was sure. Right. That was exactly. I know.